So we're going to start here. We're still working through supporting the New Testament historically. I'm going to go through a couple points of addressing atheist claims, criticisms of the Bible, basically. Things that people would say invalidate the Bible. These are things that they're related to the topic and things I've seen people actually try to claim before. And also just that chose ones that I think are good things you can learn from. Bring us in some interesting points and learning topics in the Bible. So yeah, we'll go through a couple of those. And it's also just to break up the history. That way it's not all straight learning history stuff. So just a little bit of a change up on the lesson. So the first claim. I've seen somebody claim that this prophecy that Jesus read is an inaccurate prophecy and that it invalidates Jesus in the Bible. Okay? And so it's Luke 4. He's quoting from Isaiah 61. And we're just going to focus on this underlined part here. But basically, this is Jesus quoting Isaiah. All right? He's quoting Isaiah who prophesied about him. All right? So it says, "He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recover sight to the blind." All right? But if you flip to Isaiah, where it comes, what you read in Isaiah is, "He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted and proclaim liberty to the captives." Now, this is the same thing here. Proclaim release to the captives, proclaim liberty to the captives. That's just English translation word choice. But that's the same. What's different is, "He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted" comes first, and then "recover sight of the blind" comes afterwards. And so there's actually there's an alteration there, right? And so this person claimed, well, that means Jesus is reading an inaccurate prophecy about himself. And really, we can just kind of dive into the history of this and why this exists this way. This isn't just like, oh, Jesus misspoke or something like that. There's actual history behind this. So in the first century synagogues, they primarily read Greek. So Jesus wasn't reading the Hebrew. He was reading Greek. And almost all the writing in the first century synagogues was Greek. The Archaeology has shown that. And so Jesus was reading what's called the Septuagint translation. And the Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. This is Septuagint. So what happened was, the Hebrew text had a variation, and the variation read like this, right? And the accurate Hebrew text is probably this one, because most of them look this way, but there is a variant in the text. And the variant was copied into the Greek translation. So this is what they had in the synagogues, and Jesus read from that. Does this invalidate the prophecy? No. I mean, if this is the accurate prophecy, Jesus still fulfilled it. Does Jesus reading this invalidate him, his authority, or the prophecy about him? No, it just means he decided on that day, when he read the scripture, he read from the Greek. And if there was a variant that got into the Greek, okay. Or maybe that was the accurate one. Who knows? We know there's a variant, and one form of the variant came into the Greek, and he read from it. It's not really all that meaningful. It doesn't even say anything all that different. It's really the same idea. Jesus and the rabbis were probably aware of this variant, just like our modern scholars are aware of the variants in our modern texts, and we're okay with it. It's part of the way translating text goes. I'm not surprised Jesus read the Greek. Almost everybody did at the time. What this does prove is it proves that God doesn't mind us translating texts. And he seems to put up with even little errors we might even put in there when we translate the text.
It doesn't change the message.
It doesn't change the message. You're right. It doesn't. Like when you read the King James Version, there's additions into it. There's entire sentences and passages added into the King James, which aren't in my New American Standard. They're not in my NIV. And that's because the King James was made much longer ago, and they didn't have the access to the earlier copies of the Bible that we have access to today, thanks to the internet and stuff. We can actually look at the oldest Bibles that we found in history and translate from them, where the King James didn't have that luxury, right? So the King James had extra passages put in there that were added in a long time, and God seems to have blessed the King James. It's been one of the most popular English translations for the last 500 years. Another thing this proves to me is the King James Version only camp are some silly knuckleheads, because obviously Jesus is okay with reading different translations, right? All right, let's move on to another criticism that I've seen. The claim I've heard is they messed up the resurrection week, so why should we even trust that it happened if they can't even get their story straight, right? And this is where this is a primary place where the criticism comes from. So what it is this is John talking about the resurrection week. And the Jews, because it was the day of preparation, so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, asked Pilate if their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So we're all familiar with that. But John's saying that they'd be on the cross on the Sabbath. And so the criticism goes like this. If Jesus was on the Sabbath, how did he raise 3 days later on a Sunday? If he was on the cross on Saturday, how did he die and raise up 3 days later on a Sunday? Because 3 days later would be Tuesday, right?
Never thought of that.
So that's the criticism. And it doesn't hold up because you have to remember that the Passover is a Sabbath. It's a Passover week. Passover Sabbath and the Saturday Sabbath. 2 Sabbaths, right? So the holiday is a Sabbath. And I'm going to show you the timeline here. So there's the timeline. So one thing we have to remember is this. Jewish days were different. Their day started at night and ended the next night. So instead of 12 to 12, their day was 6 to 6. 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. So if this is Thursday started on Wednesday night and ended Wednesday evening, ended Thursday evening. So 6 p.m. is this cutoff. Then Friday is Thursday evening, and Friday ends Friday evening. Saturday starts here and ends here, and Sunday starts here and ends here. Does that make sense? Their days were 6p to 6p instead of 12a to 12a like ours. Okay, so just a different day structure. So that matters when you count days. So we'll just walk through this. The Passover is on Wednesday. Jesus is on the cross Thursday. Okay? He's dead by 3 p.m. All right? These are things that you can draw from the Gospels. He's dead by 3 p.m. and he's off the cross. This is where John's put. Take him off the cross before the Sabbath, okay? The feast, they had the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The special Sabbath was here on Friday. So your special Sabbath is Friday, and your weekly Sabbath is Saturday. So there's 2 Sabbaths, 2 days in a row, all right? And then your weekly Sabbath starts the next day, your Saturday, which is Sunday night, Friday night into Saturday. Then Jesus rises on Sunday. So where you see John coming in is here. Hey, let's take them off before the Sabbath begins, which would be this day here. So here, hey, let's break their legs here so they die before the evening. They actually gave themselves only the morning to try to kill these people before the Sabbath, because the extra Sabbath is here. So this is where you see John, that verse from John happening right here on the timeline. So if Jesus dies on Thursday, that's 1 day. Well, technically this is 1 day. 1 day, 2 days, and then 3 days. All right? So you see 1, 2, 3. Make sense? If he's dead here, that's another day, that's another day, that's another day. All right? Now we're going to jump back into our regular history teaching, now that you guys got a little break. And some interesting information, right? I think that stuff's interesting. It's kind of neat to see how the week played out, because when you read the Gospels, they don't give you just a straight timeline, which is why you get the whole confusion anyways, and which is why critics come up and say weird stuff like this. They just never seen the timeline played out. And there's actually multiple timelines that work out. Like, if you shift this around a little bit, you can still count 3 days or 3 nights according to the Jewish calendar, and it's okay, you know. So this isn't even the only theory on the way it played out. But I'd say this is the most accurate one, and I'd say this happened about 30 A.D. The calendars show it could be 30 A.D., it could be 33 A.D., the way that the Passover would have fallen on the days of the week. But I think it's most likely 30 A.D.
Quick question, what's the A.D. again? What's that supposed to mean? Because I always thought it was after death. I think you said before.
It's after birth. It's a Greek term. I think it's like Adonos, Dominos, something along those terms. And BC is like, yeah, it's just before birth. So 0 AD is about when Jesus was born. But he was actually probably born a few years before that. You know, if you correlate, I believe Josephus records about when King Herod died, he probably died a few years before 0. So it probably puts Jesus about 4 BC being born. But, you know, we didn't have such a great scholarship back when they made, you know, because they made the this Roman calendar. Rome made this calendar a few hundred years later, so they didn't have as great historical scholarship. So they missed it. They missed the accurate date by a few years, but they got it pretty close. But basically, it's the 0 is Jesus' birth, not his death. All right, so intertextual consistency. So basically, moving on with supporting the Bible, the New Testament historically. Intertextual consistency means this. Intertextual meaning in the Bible. We're going to be looking at some stuff inside the Bible text that is consistent with one another. Different authors agreeing with one another. And when you get different people saying the same thing in history, you could say, wow, this is more accurate history. It's not just one guy's account of what happened. It's multiple people saying the same thing, multiple eyewitnesses. You know, you're like if you're a cop building a case, you take multiple eyewitnesses' accounts and put them together, and then you say, okay, this story adds up. Everyone said they saw this guy do the crime, so I believe him, you know? All right, so we're going to go through a few of these guys. So you got Paul, John, Luke, Peter, and these are just, people just made up these pictures. It's just, I put some color on the screen for you guys, but obviously that's not what they look like. Who knows what they look like? So last class we talked about textual criticism. I had mentioned the word. And what it is textual criticism is a branch of scholarship that they analyze a text and say, okay, this letter here and this letter here, these were both written by the same author probably, right? So they can look at the writing style, the word choice, the sentence structure, the repetition of certain things, and they could say, well, these 2 letters are written by the same guy. So for the most part, the authorship that we see in the New Testament adds up to, you know, Paul's letters mostly look the same. You know, John's writings mostly look by the same guy. Luke's writings are both by Luke, the same guy. Acts and Luke are both written by the same guy. And also a couple of Paul's letters were also scribed by Luke. And so you can see there's the same guys making these writings. So it's not like you can just say, well, we don't know who wrote these things. Well, we know the same people wrote a lot of these, and the history adds up to pointing to the authors that are ascribed to it. So we can trust that the authors we have written down in our New Testament are the accurate and real authors. And you do run into this. A lot of critics will just say, well, who knows who even wrote these things? Well, we do know who wrote these things, and you can track history and look at the evidence, and we can be sure that what we're believing in is true and real. So I'm going to show you how these guys back each other up, okay? Paul quotes Jesus quite a lot. We had reviewed a piece from 1 Timothy where Paul says, as the scripture says, laborer is worthy of his wages, I believe it was. And he's not quoting the Old Testament. He's quoting the gospel. So you literally have Paul saying the scripture says this, and he's quoting the gospel. So you've got Paul quoting the gospel. And he says other things too straight from the gospels. He says, the entire law is fulfilled in keeping one commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. That's Galatians 5:14 and Romans 3:18. Both say that. Word for word quoting Jesus, right? You guys know that's Jesus. You hear that and you say, oh, it's Jesus' writing. Paul's quoting Jesus again. So that's two places he's directly quoting the Gospels. Yet most scholars, even most Christian scholars, will say Paul's writings are from the 50s, 60s AD and the Gospels were written after that time. Well, how's Paul quoting Scripture multiple times, quoting the Gospel multiple times if the Gospels weren't written yet? Obviously, they had Gospel writing predating Paul's time. At least, maybe not the Gospels looking exactly like we have today, maybe early notes, or maybe we just have the dates wrong, which is very likely. It's very hard to date a lot of these things. Anytime I give you dates here, they're going to be approximations. So it's very likely the Gospels were already in circulation. Especially when Paul's traveling with the guy who wrote one of them. Like, let's be real. Paul's going around quoting them, and this isn't the only one. I mean, he's got multiple references to the Gospel. Even those two I just said, there are others out there, especially in Romans. He's got a few. John quoting Jesus. In 1 John 4:21, he quotes the same exact thing I just read, of the whole law is fulfilled in these commandments. And so we've got multiple authors here, both quoting Jesus word for word. And that means something, I think when you see it also, it's if they're quoting Jesus, they know that the people they're talking to know it's from Jesus. Like, just like they would quote the Old Testament, and they do quote the Old Testament, quoting the New and putting it in their writing means that they expected their audience to know the reference they're making. So that means that not only did these guys have access to the writing, but their audience, they expected their audience to have access to the writing and know what they're talking about.
Well, Jesus himself did that.
Yeah, yep. And they didn't quote passages like, chapter 5, verse 4. Like, they didn't have those little annotations on there. They didn't have the reference markers the way we do now. Those little markers we put in the chapter verse markers, those didn't come in till like the 1500s. So, I mean, they're just going to read it and expect the audience to know what you're talking about. Paul and Luke obviously agree so much because they traveled together. Their mission trips were together, right? Paul talks about his conversion. Luke records the narrative of the conversion, right? And so you've got multiple books saying the same thing about Paul's conversion and about their trips together. And even these obscure characters, Priscilla and Aquila, appear in Acts 18. Well, Luke records that, but then Paul references Priscilla and Aquila like 3 times in his writings. So you got these two guys 4 times referencing Priscilla and Aquila, and you probably don't even know who they are. They just had a few references. There's really no narrative on them. All we know is that they came from Rome when there was some persecution going on, and Paul says they risked their skin to save their necks. So they saved Luke and Paul's life. So that's why they get four references, because they saved the apostles' lives. So there were some really nice people, some good companions, so they get all these references. But it just shows you, even these obscure characters are agreed upon in these writings. In John's Gospel, you also get Paul referencing Peter as Cephas, and in the next sentence he calls him Peter. So he says Cephas and Peter within a few sentences. He uses both names a few times. And so Paul is using the word Cephas that John recorded in his gospel. Remember, John records Jesus telling Peter, "I'm going to call you the rock." Cephas is the Greek of the rock, Cephas. So Paul knew that Jesus had renamed Peter and was using the rock rename. Okay. Now Peter knows Paul too. Peter writes in 2 Peter 3:16. He says, Paul's writing is hard to understand, and some people twist it and distort it. Okay? So Peter knew Paul's writing, but he says it's Scripture. He calls it Scripture. He is calling his writing Scripture. So we can trust Paul's writing as Scripture. And we knew it was circulating in the churches in Peter's day, right? That's significant. And so there's a whole bunch more of this, but I kind of just gave you the highlights and stuff I've noticed. But all these guys are saying the same stuff, and it all backs up the history behind it, and it puts it together at a very early time. Like we can trust our Bible, right? This guy Erastus is cool. And it's interesting the way you can weave together history with archaeology, because you're going to see an archaeological finding that shows Erastus. So this is cool. So hang with me here. Paul, in the book of Romans, says Erastus, the city treasurer, and he's talking about Corinth, okay? So this guy Erastus is a city treasurer of Corinth, right? That's an elected position, elected government position as treasurer of Corinth. All right? You also see Erastus in 2 Timothy. Erastus remained at Corinth because he had a job there. He stayed with his job, right? In Acts 19, you see they were sent to Macedonia. Two of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus. So it's interesting the way this weaves together because you learn a lot about him. You say he's the treasurer at Corinth. He didn't do so many missions. He did a mission trips here, but then stopped doing the missions here because he had a job to do, right? And then you see Erastus traveled with Timothy, and then Paul wrote to Timothy about Erastus, right? It makes sense if they were traveling companions that Paul would mention Erastus when he was writing to Timothy, because they were buddies, right? Kind of interesting, right? So that's what we learn about Erastus. So watch this. Based on the way these tablets look, this is a stone tablet with Greek writing, and based on the way the writing is, they can say this is a 1st century tablet, okay? It's a 1st century piece of writing. All right, so a 1st century tablet says this: Erastus, in return for his aedileship means an elected government position, so Erastus, in return for his elected government position, laid the pavement at his own expense. So this is on a piece of pavement. They probably paved a walkway or something, or paved a road. And Erastus paid for the road to be paved, because basically he said, if you elect me, I'll pave this road for you on my own money. That's basically what it's saying. He made a political promise, and in return for being elected, he got this road paved. And that's what this tablet says.
That's nice. Somebody of their word.
Yeah, you don't see that very often. Yep. So, and you can see it's pretty big. You can see someone's feet right here. See that? So this thing's probably about as tall as a person, it looks like, right? Because if that's someone's legs, I mean, they're probably, if not taller than a person. This thing's probably 6 to 10 feet long. So what we learn in the Bible about Erastus, you see it right there on a 1st century stone tablet writing about the guy. That's pretty cool, right? Now, just like you get consistencies in the Bible, you get variations in the Bible. But the variations are consistent too, which is pretty cool. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. But there was a guy who was he was like a police detective who would take people's stories, and he was an atheist, and when he read the Gospels and saw this kind of stuff happening, he actually believed it was historically valid, and he was no longer an atheist. He started to believe because he saw the truth in this. What you get is that the Gospels especially put together different pieces of the story of Jesus' timeline. And this is a nice example here. When Jesus is getting beaten, right before they crucify him, he's arrested, and he's in the high priest's quarters under arrest. Okay, and the guards start beating him, and they say, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" Now, if you're getting beaten up by somebody, don't you think you'd know who hit you? But in Matthew, you're just like, why is he saying that? And I remember reading this, because I read Matthew before I read Luke. And I remember reading that and being like, why are they saying to prophesy who hit him? Are they asking to prophesy the name of the person who hit him? Like, why wouldn't he know who hit him, right? But Luke is a much more educated man, so he's not going to forget, important details. So Luke actually fills in the blanks here. They blindfolded him and demanded, prophesy who hit you. So Luke put in, they blindfolded him. And he fills in what Matthew left out. If you put the parallel passages together, you learn a lot more in the Gospels. And so that's why knowing the whole thing and looking at parallel passages is important because you can learn a lot more about Jesus when you look at the parallel passages and a lot more about what's going on, and you can avoid preaching mistakes too. All right, we're going to go into a few archaeological pieces. Archaeology is fun. I love seeing the pictures of this stuff, right? All right, here's a fun fact. There's this guy named Colin Hemmer. He identified 84 facts from the last 16 chapters of Acts. I don't know why he went at the end. Acts has more chapters than that. He skipped the first few for some reason. Maybe because there's less in those first few. But basically, the last 16 chapters of Acts, he identified 84 historical facts. And you can go online and look at all these things. And basically, if there's 16 chapters, that's going to be 5 or 6 historical accuracies each chapter, right? But there's a lot more than that too. I mean, that's just what one guy found. I'm sure there's a lot more. And there's a ton of archaeological evidence to back up the Bible as a whole, and especially the New Testament, because the New Testament's more recent, and Rome had a lot better records, and the archaeology is a lot better preserved because it's newer. All right, so this is an ossuary. That's a bone box. All right, so when they buried people in the first century, they would sometimes put them in bone boxes. They'd put their bones in a box and save the bones. I think this was more like people you really wanted to honor, something you'd invest a little more in. Because I know they also had they'd put bodies in the mountainside, kind of like what you did with Lazarus when he was put into the mountainside with the rock sealing the tomb.
Like a carved out into the rock.
Exactly, they'd carve right into the side of the mountain. Yep, and they'd put the bodies in there. And I think those were a little cheaper. I think this is a little more, I'm investing a little more money in it kind of thing. But this is Caiaphas. This is the guy who crucified Jesus. He crucified Jesus. We got his bones, right? So look, we can all rest assured that the guy who killed Jesus is dead. Right? If you didn't think he would have died by now, he's dead and we got his bones, right? All right. Next, the Pilate stone. Pontius Pilate, the guy, he's the one who technically put in the legal order to crucify Jesus. But Caiaphas is the one who kind of orchestrated the show and put the pressure on Pilate to do it. Pilate's interesting, too, because historians record that Pilate was under a lot of political pressure from his superiors. And that's most likely why he was trying to stop a riot, because Pilate was literally this close to getting fired when he crucified Jesus. He was already about to be fired. So when Jesus comes up and the Sanhedrin and the Jews are making a big fuss about Jesus, Pilate's just all right, if a riot happens today, I'm getting fired, so whatever, just crucify him. I'm going to wash my hands of the matter, and don't put it on me. Just please don't throw a riot because they're going to kill me. But this stone's broken, as you can see. But that's where the dots come in. But this is what you have so it says, to the divine Augusti Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this. So that's all you get of the tablet. But literally, it's a tablet with Pilate dedicating whatever the rest of this says to the emperor there. Kind of cool, right? This is an image from the National Bible Museum in Washington, D.C. I know I've said this before, but it's such a cool visit to go there. Mind-blowing, just jaw-dropping, all the way, walking around the place like this. So cool, the stuff you see in there. So this was a picture I took there, just a bunch of Jewish coins. And you see, a lot of these had some of the leaders' faces on it and stuff like that. These are first century coins. And I think I have a Pilate coin, that right there. That's a Pilate coin right there from 30. That's from about the time Jesus died. They put 30 CE on it. So that's probably the year Jesus died. They actually marked it as the exact year he died. But of course, these are rough dates, of course. But yeah, it's a Pilate coin. Oh, it even says it was minted in Jerusalem. So that was made in Jerusalem the year Jesus died. How cool is that? And we've got coins from all these different political leaders that you see appear in the Bible. Herod Agrippa the First, Herod Agrippa the Second, King Herod the Great, Tiberius Caesar, Claudius Caesar, and Pilate. All these guys have coins, which is pretty cool.